Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jared. I'm an atheist. And this week, past couple of weeks, I had the immense pleasure of going on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Egypt, the home of Coptic Christianity, which is one of the coolest expressions of Christianity I have ever seen. With all those niceties out of the way, let me tell you about the coolest branch of Christianity that you maybe never heard of. There's a lot of really cool things about Coptic Christianity just straight from the get-go. First and foremost, a lot of them have really cool tattoos. This is a real thing. I'm not BSing you. To the dismay of church grandmas everywhere, it is a very well-established tradition that's probably maybe up to 1,000 years old, where Christians in Egypt will often get a small cross tattooed on their wrist or on the bone of their thumb. It is a strong and kind of in-your-face cultural identifier that this person is a Copt rather than a Muslim. Coptic Christians also have their own pope. However, the role of pope within Coptic Christianity looks slightly different than in Roman Catholicism. And Egypt has some of the coolest, biggest, most beautiful churches and monasteries anywhere in the world. Speaking of churches, Sarah, my host for this entire trip, got me these for my birthday, and these might make it onto an album of mine. Coptic churches and cathedrals often feel like Eastern Orthodox churches and cathedrals. The iconostasis up at the front with all of its icons of the Theotokos and the different saints and the 12 apostles, all of that very closely resembles the kind of iconostasis that you would find in an Antiochian church or in a Greek church, etc., etc. However, Coptic iconography has more of like a dynamic breadth to it though. There's more creative liberties that can be taken stylistically, it feels like. And sincerely, sometimes the icons, they look borderline cartoonish. It's a really unique style. Coptic Christianity uses as its liturgical language the Coptic language. The Coptic language basically is an ancient form of Egyptian that utilizes the Greek alphabet with a few altercations, changes, I think. And the Copts have an incredibly long, incredibly dense liturgy. I'm gonna be so for real. I have never fallen asleep in church so many times in my entire life. I tried to be a good trooper to the best of my ability, but man, sleep deprivation there was so real. It was just nonstop. Literally our first day, I think we woke up at 3 a.m. to go and pray the liturgy, and it just keeps going and keeps going, and it's 3 a.m. and it's 4 a.m. and it's 5 a.m. and then it's 6 a.m. and then at some point I just broke. I caved, and I asked Sarah, like, hey, I am so sorry. Can I go take a nap in the car? I cannot hold myself up anymore. The ability of monks to do that for hours and hours on end, that's an art that you guys have mastered. Patience. I don't have it. It was so wonderful just walking around Coptic places, and little kids would run up to him and they would yell, Abuna, Abuna, give me a blessing. On that topic, I want to talk about like some of the generalities that I saw among Coptic Christians there. Coptic Christianity has to be one of the warmest, most familial expressions of Christianity that I have ever seen. Now, part of that is just friendships in the Middle East. They're a lot more intimate and, you know, handsy, assuming that it's with the same gender. But even accounting for that, Coptic Christianity just feels very familial. It's beautiful. All the time when Diggy and I were walking around, people would run up to him and they would want to talk to him. They would ask for a blessing. They would try to kiss his hand. And beyond that, they would, you know, want to confide in him. And I'm trying to think, but like, I can't imagine that happening to like a normal Protestant pastor. One, because he doesn't have like an obvious identifier that he is a pastor if he's a Protestant. But even then, there's not like an excitement from like little kids that, oh, this is the pastor, this is the father, this is the priest. But in that community, it's like the priests, the fathers, the abunas, they are seen as spiritual fathers that you can confide in. And that was just very wild to me to see that it's like that widespread. It's like, it's just assumed that if you are donning a cassock, you are automatically a safe person. And I don't know how you get there, that you instill that much trust in a community, that you win that much trust in a community, that you live out your faith that well, that symbol of, you know, a holy garb actually means something to the people. So definitely one of the biggest highlights of this trip was going to these monasteries. And just like, as a universal, doing what I do, one of my favorite parts is always talking to clergy, because that's often like a lot more telling than talking to the parishioners. Because, you know, in theory, the clergy are the ones who take this really seriously, and you can kind of see like, okay, where is the clergy leading these people? Who is he trying to get these people to become? And hopefully the clergy are a little bit further in that journey, you know, to becoming the idealized version of themselves, right? And man, dude, I was falling in love with the monks all the time. Consistently. They were so humble and so gracious and fun. They were really fun. I mean, don't get me wrong, they didn't have like super soakers, but I mean, they were a joy to speak to. One of the first monasteries that we went to was the monastery of St. Macarius. And just consistently, it seemed like the monks liked each other, like they were friends. They would hold hands and they would, you know, laugh with each other. And they had an ostrich farm there for some reason. That was cool. The other thing that's cool about the monks is that historically, from what I understand, the monks were not always very well educated. In Coptic Christianity, the whole ordeal is primarily to focus on prayer and focus on cultivating love and humility. And yet, at the same time, most of the monks that I visited were very, very erudite, very well read. Sometimes that was as an extension of them being monks. Other times it was just an extension of them being Egyptian. The meme is that, you know, if you're raising Egyptian children, they have three options. They can be an engineer, a doctor, or a failure. And so a lot of the monks that I spoke with, they had, you know, previous careers in archaeology or in psychology. One of the monks that I hung out with a good bit was Abuna Arsani, and he was actively getting his PhD at Notre Dame. But he said something that really stuck out to me. He said, kind of just in passing, you know, I make it a point that everyone that I minister to, all of the people in my parish, have my phone number. Because if I have this title of father or Abuna just means father, if they don't have a way to get in contact with them, then the whole title of father is a lie. And that's awesome. That is really wonderful. One of the other monasteries that we went to was Al-Maharak Monastery, I believe, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the monastery perched on top of the land where, you know, allegedly the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, had their flight to Egypt. And again, there, it was the same thing. More wonderful monks who were really cool. But I have to give it to those monks because they all had even more tattoos. They all had like gone to Jerusalem together, and they all had like, you know, a big cross here and like Jerusalem 2022. It was really funny. It's very ironic that Egypt, one of the loudest countries in the world, is the birthplace of Christian monasticism. While there almost certainly were monks prior to the monks in Egypt, it was there in Egypt where the monks started to go into the wilderness, to go into the desert and hide themselves away in the caves to just solely devote themselves to lives of prayer and fasting. Saint Anthony of the Desert is famous for being the father of monasticism, and his cave, allegedly, was there in Egypt, and we got to go and explore it. And if you watch this channel long enough, I'm always bragging about silence. Silence that happens in every Muslim prayer service, silence that happens amongst the Quakers, and silence that happens amongst the prayers of the Orthodox. And there is something so hallowed about silence there in the desert. And while I was there, it was so funny. I was reading, you know, some of the quotes from the Desert Fathers, right? Some of the earliest monks to go out and just hide themselves away for weeks at a time in the desert. And there's this story in there about two monks who had just devoted themselves to living lives of piety and kindness and gentleness and respect. And they had a conversation amongst themselves and said, you know, we've never had a quarrel. And it's this hilarious story of like one monk saying to the other monk, well, I don't know how to have a quarrel. And the other monk says, okay, well, I'll start. Here, this is my brick. And then the other monk says, okay, And then he says, no, you're supposed to say it's my brick. And he says, oh, it's my brick. And then the other monk says, okay. Oh, shit, I'm not doing this justice. Yeah, man, like Egypt being a desert, it's like obviously, you can just look at a map, but it's different when you're driving for 5 hours and you haven't seen, more than like a few blades of grass or a couple of trees. Just how vast, the never ending sand is. It's wild. It's surreal. And Saint Anthony of the Desert famously went and had his wrestlings with the devil out in the desert. And it's a damn good place to do it, man. We summited the cave of Saint Anthony. It's at the top of this big mountain, and it's the cave where he allegedly hid himself away to pray and fast. And you go in there, and it's really nothing. It's this long tunnel, and then at the end of it, people have put up, just a couple of icons. The main icon of Christ in the back, and then a couple of St. Anthony in the front, and maybe a Theotokos on the side. And you just sit in that cave, and it's a stillness that feels unsettling. I was wildly sleep deprived, and I would sit and just think, and I could feel myself, phasing in and out of sleep, in and out of consciousness, and just the thoughts, the visions that bubble up to the fore. It's fascinating. It's like holding up a mirror to yourself. What have you been ruminating on? What have you been stewing on? And a lot of those things are worth wrestling against. Wrestling with. True story. When we were at the monastery of St. Anthony, we pulled up at like 4 a.m, and you get out of the car and you're surrounded by desert. You're finally far enough away from Cairo that you don't hear anything. And it's just the silent whisper of the wind. And then you look up and you see this bright array of stars, brighter than you've ever seen. And then you kind of mosey into this monastery that is, hundreds or maybe even 1,000 years old. And you're looking around and it's like, whoa. And then you go inside the church where the monks are chanting the liturgy in the Coptic, and you hear them clanging the cymbal and banging the triangle and chanting in unison. And I was very sleepy. And I'm pretty sure I actually passed out there on the floor of the church and actually like propped my head up. It may have been some of the remains of St. Anthony. Whoops. Nobody yelled at me though. And that's very deeply appreciated. And something about that, like, maybe this is a weird jumping off point, but it felt gracious that there was nobody there to, whack my hand with a ruler. And kind of one of the recurring themes, one of the recurring senses that I got was it felt like Coptic Christianity is properly ordered. There's tradition, but it's not merely tradition. There's asceticism, but it's not so rigid and hard-nosed that it forgets that ultimately it's all about love. And there is love, and there is grace, and there is humility, but it's not a free-for-all. It's not licentiousness or antinomianism. But it felt sincerely like love was at the epicenter of this whole thing, and it just flowed very naturally throughout the rest of it. Protestants will often caricature high church people and say, oh man, it's just about the tradition, it's just about the liturgy, it's just about saying the right magical words, and there's no heart, there's no soul behind it. And I was so blown away by the beauty and the profundity and the intimacy. Now, when high church just becomes a relic of itself, when it just becomes about the forms and the traditions that were passed down to us, you lose me, and I don't give a crap about any of that. But when it is a lived, experiential faith, and that person is, communing with God himself, that's where I start to get interested. I keep my ear to the ground with like a lot of different religious movements and people and things. And sometimes I'll run across Protestants who take to the internet and say things like, "Ah, man, this or that preacher is a heretic. I wish that they would just stick with the Bible." So many Protestants really hyper emphasize the idea that it's a cornerstone part of any person's personal devotion that they go and take their Bible and go and read it by themselves. They go and have quiet time with God, and they go and have Bible time. They read the Bible for themselves. And that's fine. That's good. You should do that, even if you're an atheist. But I think a problem arises when you ask yourself, okay, well, how long has that been a thing in the church? The reality is that that wasn't possible for the average person before the printing press, and it certainly wasn't a common thing before the 18th century. And so, like, how can it be the case that this thing is supposed to be, one of the defining features of personal piety if it wasn't even available? It didn't exist for the vast majority of the church's history. So Protestants give liturgies a really bad rap. And especially for me, as a non-Coptic speaker, it was a little boring. I couldn't follow along. I couldn't sing with it. But I fully acknowledge the beauty of it. The beauty is that when you go through the liturgy, spoiler alert, it's the Bible. It's a lot of Bible. It's the story of the Bible consolidated in a way that helps you memorize it. But beyond that, it contextualizes the stories within a proper theological framework. And so, for all of these Protestants who want to just say over and over and over again, like, "Oh man, I just wish that people would just read their Bibles." The assumption and the hope there is that people will read their Bible and then they will be led by the Holy Spirit to have correct biblical interpretation. And I hate to be that guy. I hate to tell you this, but like, how many more factions of Protestants do you need before you accept that that's not going to happen in mass? Like, there's kind of this silly illusion that like, oh man, if everyone just read the Bible and prayed in sincerity, they would all come to the exact same doctrinal statement. And that has never happened anywhere in the history of mankind, ever. And then whenever somebody has a bad interpretation or a heretical interpretation, the only explanation is that, well, they must have just not been praying in the Spirit. They must have just not been rightfully guided by God. Or they were predestined to do so because they, for some reason, were a piece of crap, a vessel of destruction. Or maybe you could say that the practice of being a lone ranger and trying to come up with your own biblical analysis in a vacuum leads to bad outcomes. And liturgy is a really nice guardrail against that. You're reading the Bible in the context that it's meant to be read in. One of the wildest churches that we went to while we were in Egypt was the Church of the 21 Martyrs. And this is a recently erected church. Back in 2015, there was a very heinous event that took place. There was a group of men from Egypt working in Libya until they were kidnapped by members of ISIS. And those men were brutally tortured for several days before being hauled out to a beach, and one by one they were asked to recant their faith. They did not a single one of them, and all 21 of those Christians had their throats slit on camera. And this church, the Church of the 21 Martyrs, was made and dedicated in part by the widows of these men. Every single one of them proclaimed Jesus to their death. And so, I can hear the chatter of some hard-nosed Christians, but tell the grieving widows of those men that they weren't true believers, or that they weren't true Christians. Really? One of the last places that we visited while we were in Egypt, actually back in Cairo, was Garbage Village. Garbage Village is a pretty famous place in Cairo. It's a village of largely Christians who are trash collectors and recyclers. Largely, they are the poorest of the poor. And in spite of that, it is the home of one of the largest churches in all of Egypt. The monastery of Simon the Tanner, or the Cave Church, as it's more commonly known, is this huge church that was literally hewn out of the side of a cave. And man, one of my favorite parts of the whole trip was just watching Diggy there, hang out with the kids. There were like Coptic youth groups there exploring and praying. And he just made time for all of them. And they ran up to him and, he would pinch their cheeks, or he would, give them a hug, or, just talk to them about love and humility and the Bible. And then, so I could blabber on about this all day, but I feel like that gets the gist across, right? This was absolutely, bleep this out, editor, if you want, shit insane. This was so freaking crazy, and I am so grateful. All in all, I had an absolute blast getting to rediscover one of the hidden gems of Christendom. Coptic Christianity is awesome. It is one of the most beautiful expressions of faith that I have found anywhere, and I was really overjoyed to get to experience this whole thing. To Robert, to Diggy, and to Sarah, and to all of my Patreon supporters, thank you guys sincerely so much for allowing this to happen. This meant the world to me. So, my name is Jared. I'm an atheist. Go to the desert.